Hey everyone. I am going to give a talk. I don't have a lot of introductions, but for those who don't know, I'm one of the creators of LESS, and I'll leave it with that. And let's see, I have no idea how this talk will go. I don't know how long it will be either, so we'll figure that out. And also, I didn't have a very interesting title, I guess. Um, I will be talking about uh, technical practices, Scrum. And also, and this is a bit awkward, but my presentation actually contains more questions than answers because I'm going to try to share some of my thinking and questions that I have not answered yet. So then you can share the questions and then maybe we'll find an answer for that one day. Okay. Now, this talk started with this, I guess, potential insight that we talk a lot about technical practices, and um, every LESS adoption that I'm involved with, we spend a lot of time on technical practices. Usually I start with that. But it's a problem over and over again in virtually every LESS adoption. And one of the insight was that maybe the technical practices are actually not technical practices. But instead, and I tried to think of a better name, and I ended up with, they are social team practices that require technical skill. Which is, I need to figure out a way to make that shorter, but for now that will do. And why is that important? One of the things I think I experienced is that by calling them technical practices, we actually prevented the adoption of these social team practices that require technical skill. And therefore, it's important that we focus on that because by calling them technical practices, to many people, they feel kind of optional or additional, but they often don't feel like foundational or essential. So what I'd like to explore in this presentation is why I would consider the technical practices more team practices than technical practices, and what makes them so essential, and why you need to focus on them in your LESS adoption. There. So why? I don't have a lot of pictures in my... Another thing that I want to explore a little bit is LESS has a very strong team focus, but we rarely talk about why would we have a team focus? What is actually the advantage of working as a team versus working individual? Other than, and I'll get to this, maybe it's just nicer to work in a team, but that doesn't sound like a very convincing or good argument. So we'll need to figure also out a little bit what are the benefits of actually working as a team. And a couple years ago, I did a talk about politics in Munich. And in that talk, I accidentally decided to build up a systems model of my thinking in related to politics. And people liked that. So I decided to do the same again. But it was very accidental because I just tried to structure my own thoughts, and then I ended up with a systems model. And I thought, okay, since I don't have any better content of this presentation, let me just add the systems model there. I'd like to start with what Craig, you'll hear from him tomorrow, what he likes to call adaptiveness, but I'll just stick with the older goals of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve an organization that is able to respond to changes in the market, technology, solutions, etc. That's one thing we want to achieve. And we want to achieve maximizing value delivery, so working on the most valuable thing. And I decided not to separate these two variables this time, but just do as if they're one overall variable. So let's start with that. Now, how we're trying to achieve that in less. Let me first explain this a little bit. I've tried to color code the changes in the system model versus the previous one. So whenever you see this red, it means in this slide, the red ones are new, and the black ones were there already. So that hopefully that makes it easier to follow. Okay. So in less, we basically say the three main variables that would impact response to change and delivering value to customers is work in progress, which we want to minimize, learning, and cost of change. And work in progress and cost of change are relatively obvious, I think. And learning is one that doesn't feel very obvious, maybe. And you could also complicate this and then put learning to work in progress or learning to cost in change. But I decided to simplify this model and say, you know what, we'll just take that as a this level variable. So the three things we focus on is trying to reduce the amount of work in progress, trying to maximize the amount of learning, and trying to reduce the cost of change. And if we focus on these three things, then that would lead to optimizing towards responding to change and delivering value to customers. There. Now, what are the things that would influence work in progress? And my first couple of systems models will be about one team. So I'm first going to focus mostly on one team. And then towards the end, I'll share what is the difference between one team and multiple teams. And you'll discover it is virtually nothing. So if you have one team, then clearly the amount of items that a team is working on at the same time, yeah, it's actually not really a new variable, but I wanted to make it explicit. So we say if they the amount of items they work on increases, the WIP increases, etc., etc., etc. If the amount of items the team works on increases, then the amount of time working together will decrease. Right? So if you have a team of 4 and there's 4 items that they're working on at the same time, then probably that team will not work very much together. Instead, everyone will pick up one item and work on their item. But if you have a team of 4 and you have only one item that you're working on, then most of the teams, they don't say you work on this item and the other 3 do nothing, but instead they tend to start working more together. And then the cost of change, you'll see me ignoring that a lot in this presentation. But here I link the variable ease of change. The easier it is to change, the lower the cost of change. There we go. Now, this slide, this part took me a long time to be comfortable with it. But what I'm saying here is that if you reduce the amount of items the team works on, then it will increase the team's shared responsibility. Now, this is actually key because usually we think about it in the other way around. We think about it that we have a good team shared responsibility, and because they take a shared responsibility, they can work on one item at a time. But one of the things I try to express here is that maybe it's the other way around, that once you start working at one item at a time, or at a few items at a time, the effect of that will be that the team will create a shared responsibility. And of course, once we have a shared responsibility, then we go to I like to copy. We use this in the less rules, the real team, so I decided to put it also in the slide. And of course, once you're in a real team, then work satisfaction will go up, and it's good. But you know, I'd like to link back to the earlier one, which is like, it is actually good if work satisfaction would go up or does go up, but it's not one of the main variables that we were looking at. So I decided to put the question mark on, and it is questionable that that relationship is there, and even if that relationship is there, then what? Then what? How would that actually lead to better response to change, and it just leads to happier people. Okay. Now I decided to first go another direction, and that is one of the typical organization, because a typical organization will say, hey, wait a second, the amount of time people are working together will decrease individual efficiency, and that is a bad idea. And obviously, if we have more items in progress, then we are more productive, and that will increase total productivity. And if individual efficiency increases, then total productivity will increase also. Right? And of course, this is the underlying assumption that building a product is a mechanical process of just finishing tasks. And once you finish the tasks as quickly as possible, which of course you all know up front, then you'll be as productive and efficient as possible. So I'm not going to continue with this. I'll delete this again. But I wanted to put that mindset also in the model. So instead, let's focus a little bit on the amount of items that the team works at the same time. And this is a hard one for me for a systems model. This happens quite frequently, that an item, a variable relates to another variable, which is simply the ability to do the other variable. Right? So I made the ability a separate variable, which is the ability to work on a few items at the same time. And if the team has the ability to work at the same a few items at once, then it will not directly decrease the amount of items, but it's quite likely that it will decrease the amount of items there. And then I want to point out one interesting one, which is the amount of people behind one computer. I thought that was a good way to combine pair and mob programming in one variable. So the amount of people behind one computer will increase the amount of time working and the ability to work on a few items at the same time. Clearly, if you work with 100 people at the same time behind one computer, you'll have only one item in progress, and you will be working together. Of course, that's absurd, but still. A key point here, though, is that especially Craig, where you listen to his advice and what he does, he almost always says, you know, when I go into an organization, I start off with mob programming or pair programming or things like that. And the systems model so far kind of explains that, because it is simply one of the easiest variables to influence all of these. Right? It's very easy. Once you work with more people, learning will go up, amount of WIP will go down, and therefore that will lead to increased responsiveness and maximizing value delivery. Now let's look at other ways in which we can reduce the amount of items that we are working on, or the amount of work in progress. There, of course, if we want to work on fewer items at once, then we need more shared code ownership. If you don't have shared code ownership, it becomes very hard to work on fewer items. We will need the ability to split large items in small items. Right? If you of course, and I want to point out that these are kind of alternatives now. Once you pair or mob, if you mob with your whole team, then clearly the usefulness of splitting the items into very small items is not very high. But once you choose not to work with many people behind one computer, then you need to have a way of distributing, parallelizing that work. And because of that, you'll be splitting the items in very small items or technical tasks or however you call them, because that way you can have multiple people working on one item at the same time. And of course, and here I turn to Marant again, in order to split the items in very small tasks, you need to be able to work in an incremental way. Right? And again, this is just like the items to teams, the items the team works on and shared responsibility. Most of the time, I hear people thinking of them the other way around, which is splitting the items in small tasks enables the team to work incrementally, whereas I'm saying, no, maybe it's the other way around. Being able to work incrementally allows people to split the things into smaller tasks. Right? And then, of course, the integration frequency, because now this is kind of one way of working. We have now shared code small tasks, which people are working on in parallel. So therefore, the third thing we need is for those to be integrated frequently together, because otherwise it's not going to work. And I copied this slide, some of you have seen this, from my less training material, because this is just such a big topic. It seems so simple, but for developers to think about how to do things incrementally is just such a very different way of working that most developers are used to. Right? So one of the things I've done this year is, to give people some background, I used to live in Singapore for a very long time. And last year, I moved to the Netherlands. I now live in the Netherlands. Last year was an excellent year to change continent. And I was in the Netherlands, and I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. And I decided I want to join a less adoption, but also I want to work in a team as a developer, as a team member. Partly because everyone changed their training to remote training, and honestly, I hadn't really worked as a remote team member for very long in a team, and I felt very uncomfortable training people about that if I didn't do that myself. So I decided I'm just going to be a team member for a while, and work at home team member. And I've been in a team now for 8 months or so, and I still haven't met 2 or 3 of my team members ever in person, and it is really weird. But every time when I meet a team member in person, it's very nice to meet your team members in person. But I don't know if you guys have this experience. I guess so. One of the things that for some reason I noticed is that one of the biggest things about working from home and not ever meeting the people is that you don't know how tall they are. Right? I met one of my team members, and it's like, oh, wow. I never thought of that before. But so in my team, one of the things that they needed to do is they have an old version of one of the JavaScript frameworks, and they needed to upgrade that to a newer version. Now, of course, how do you do that? Right? You create a new 6 months project, you branch off, you use all opportunity to rewrite all of the other things you didn't like at the same time. And that was their original plan. Right? So I came and I said, well, it is not a way that I would recommend to do it. And they asked like, well, can you do this incrementally? So I said, sure, you can do this incrementally. And we've been secretly working on that a little bit all the time. Right? Like one of the things we did, for example, was simply um, upgrade it and fail, and then it started giving all kinds of errors. So then we just started saying, oh, the API has changed there and there and there and there, and we simply started refactoring all of those places to one place, so that if we are going to upgrade, we just need to change it in one place, and it's done. And similarly, we discovered there's lots of packages, dependencies that need to be upgraded. So we looked at all of the other packages and started upgrading them a little bit, one at a time. And that way we never branch off. We will never branch off, and we'll just gradually do the upgrade on trunk without any large task or project. Or it's not completed yet, so I can't tell you whether it's succeeded yet, but of course, I'm a developer, so I'm confident that it will succeed. But for many developers, this is really a big shift. I know I said it already 5 times already, but it is just so big to work incrementally. Just like I think last week, I paired up with one of my developers, and we were making a change, and she's looking. She says, "I can't see how I can make the change." So I said, "So let's just let this function call a new function that does nothing else than that function." So we made a change, this one level of indirection, and suddenly it was obvious how you could do that in an incremental way. But just knowing that incremental step, or even thinking about trying to find that incremental step for developers is really, really hard. Now, one of my favorite scaling methods that I recommend people to use is Limbo. So forget about less, use Limbo. It is wonderful. Has anyone ever done Limbo? Wow, still a couple of people. So let me explain it a little bit. So it comes from Kent Beck, the creator of extreme programming. So he says, he's always looking for things to become more extreme. So he created, next to TDD, he created TCR. TCR stands for test commit revert. And it means that you're developing, and every time when you save, it will automatically run your tests. And when a test passes, it will commit. And when a test fails, it will revert. So you lost your changes. So you can never make like a one-line change that doesn't compile or fails the test, because then you lose it, and you'll need to think of a way to make a change, that one-line change that will not fail the tests. And then Limbo is the scaling variant that he created. And basically the change then is that if you write a line of code, you save, it will trigger the test. If the test passes, it commits. And of course, before it commits, it pulls and updates. Right? So therefore, everyone is committing. Usually, last time we did it, we experimented with it for a while, and you commit with, I think the average commit frequency was 10 seconds or so. It's just absurd, because you're just literally getting the code that the person sitting next to you wrote 1 minute or 30 seconds ago, and now you have it suddenly appear. Now, I love this, and I would really like everyone to do this. And I noticed that it was very hard for us to do that. And I think we're not the average developers. So it will be much, much too hard. But I do recommend everyone to experiment it with this a little bit. Because one of the things we noticed is that it makes your incremental steps even smaller. You have to start thinking about, how can I make the steps even smaller than I did them before? And that makes that really worthwhile as a practice. So that takes just to map that to this, that takes the shared code ownership and ability to split items in small tasks and integration frequency. Of course, it kind of maximizes these to the maximum. And that leads to the least amount of items in progress. Good. Now let's move on with that. And there they are, the so-called technical practices. So shared code ownership was already there, but refactoring and test-driven development are two very important techniques to be able to work in an incremental way. Automated test leads to an increased confidence in your code, which leads to the ability to have shared code ownership. And of course, test-driven development accidentally leads to automated tests. It's an unfortunate side effect of test-driven development. Now, so key point here, because if we just follow this, then we've kind of answered the initial question, which is now these practices are the practices that lead to a team taking a shared responsibility. Right, so now in the systems model, it says these are the foundational practices that will create a team, not technical practices, but that will create a team. And also, it will be very hard to create a well-working team that takes a shared responsibility without adopting these practices. Of course, there are probably other variables that lead to this also, but that I left that out of scope because also that makes the message, of course, more powerful. But that's where hey, these are team practices, and if you're focused on building a team, then maybe it's a good idea to not get your team together and create a team name and working agreements and facilitate a nice meeting. Of course, those are also still good ideas, but maybe one of the most powerful things that you can do to build your team and take a shared responsibility is actually focus on these social team practices that require technical skill. Right? And of course, that makes it a little bit hard because that, of course, means that as a coach, you will require some technical skill. And one of the problems, I'll get back to that in a moment, in our coaches and trainers community, and I don't mean this as an offense in any way, is that there's a lot of coaches or Scrum Masters that purely focus on the team and don't focus on the technical practices. And they kind of then see that as additional, something the team will need to do themselves, but they're missing the point that actually learning some of those technical practices and helping your team with it might actually be one of the best ways of building a team. Let me see, yeah. Now, here I've added the other, this is awkward, but the other side of Agile, the technicalness of the technical practices. Right? Because usually when you talk about technical practices, people say refactoring leads to clean code, automated test leads to quick feedback, continuous integration leads to quick feedback and clean code lead to ease of change. And therefore you can see that the technical side of the social team practices do help also with the ability to achieve responding to change and maximizing customer value. But it's always, at least in my experience, it's almost always that side is overemphasized and the other side is underemphasized. So this is the technical Agile. So now I've just removed all the variables that we added, and this is how we typically might think of the technical practices. And then this is the social Agile side of the technical practices. And there's nothing in red. And I just to make it explicit, I added, there's no new elements, so you don't need to search for them either. Just a copy of the earlier slide. Yeah, I do like the squareness of this diagram, how it's become this square subtly. But what I'm trying to add here still is the question, so, why do we actually want to use, why do we actually want to work in a team anyway? So far we had that in a team will probably increase your work satisfaction, question mark. But there must be a better reason to work in a team. And I try to add that here. So, and the things that I added here is holding each other accountable for the quality of output that we're producing. Right? And I'll argue that one of the main reasons you might want to build a team is that the team creates this shared responsibility. And for me, a shared responsibility means holding each other accountable for the quality of what you're producing. Right? Where if I'm with him in a team, that I don't go like, oh yeah, he created crap, but he created it, so I don't care about it. But that you go like, oh, my team member created something that could be better, and we have this shared responsibility for our work. So I'm going to tell my team member, not it sucks what you did, but there might be a better way that you could solve that particular problem, and I'll try to help him with that. And also, holding each other accountable for the quality of what we produce leads to, this is very hard for me to find a good name for that. I decided to just call it more disciplined practice. And I think the best way I have here, also the amount of people behind one computer as an input for the disciplined practice. But I think the best way to describe that was a cartoon I saw a couple of weeks ago. So let me just read this, show you this cartoon. And so that is the more disciplined practice. I think it's just right. So then the more disciplined practice means that I didn't know how the hell to put this in a systems model because it kind of makes the other ones more impactful. So instead of linking the disciplined practice to increasing the impact of test-driven development, etc., I just decided to make the relationship directly to the clean code and quick feedback, and of course, the learning part. Because the more you work together in a disciplined way, the more you learn from each other, right? Once I accepted that his code is crap, and I decide not to say anything about that, then I don't learn the secret geniusness of his code that I couldn't see because I'm too stupid, or he doesn't learn why his code is crap. One of the two is true, but you can only discover that when you're going to talk about that. And you can only talk about that if you hold each other accountable for the quality of what you're producing. See, this talk is going to be shorter than the time box, I think. This one I've seen already. I wanted to add some of the current working practices in my team also there, because we have to work from home. And of course, we use Jira because it's the best tool to use in agile development. And we say often, these are not good. And I wanted to reflect that also in our model. So, of course, to say the obvious is that remote work will decrease the amount of co-location. And then co-location leads to this fluency of communication. And that's a variable that we didn't have yet, but it is an important one still. How easy it is to talk with each other. And one of the things that I was chatting with Craig yesterday, which we also mentioned, is because we know some teams and they are doing the camera on all the time. Does anyone do that here? Right, which is a great practice to have your camera on all the time. But still, if you compare that to being co-located, what happens with co-location is that you have this dynamic group forming where something is happening and we two decide to work on it and other two decide to work on something else, and it kind of happens dynamically, and they're having their own conversation. Well, they secretly listen in to each other a little bit, and that kind of flow of communication, even with practices as keeping your camera on all the time, is still not the same. Right? You're still lacking some of that flow of communication. And that flow of communication, of course, has an impact to being able to work at the same time, because as one of the ideas in LESS is communication channels map integration channels, and therefore you need to increase the frequency of integration, but you also need to increase the frequency of communication, and of course, communication sometimes leads to learning. That, of course, depends on a couple of other variables that I decided not to put in my model. And then Jira, any presentation need to bash Jira a little bit. One of the problems with Jira that I've seen is that people create larger tasks in Jira almost always, because it's a pain to create lots of tasks, and that then leads to splitting the items not in small enough items, and that leads then to people starting to work more in parallel. More in parallel on separate items. Then, questions. So this is a sincere question that I was wondering about, because when I talk with coaches, then I get some coaches that say, I think this remote work from home thing is working. This is going to be the future. Everyone will keep working from home. This is great. But I also have coaches, and I guess I'm an example of that, is when can we please go back to the office again? I want to work with my team at the same space anymore. And I try to figure out, is there anything that that would predict whether a coach thinks remote working is working or not? And so, and again, this is just a complete open question, but maybe it is that the amount of involvement in technical work makes it more obvious that it's not working because of all of the dynamics that I just described, and that could be one of the important factors for whether you consider working from home to work well or not. Again, this is not a statement. This is a puzzle that I've been thinking about. And then, of course, the other puzzle is now one of the things that happens with almost every team that I've worked with, and also the Scrum Masters and team members that I talked about, that went from in-office co-located work to remote work, to work from home, almost everyone said the effect of working from home is that work has become more individualistic. Right? In the past, we would do things more as a team, and now working as a team is significantly harder. And because of that, we work more individualistic. And of course, then, if you go to the systems diagram, more individualistic means more work in progress. More work in progress leads to spending less time together. So that also, and that is a key thing that I see happening, a dramatic reduction in learning. learning about the product, learning about practices, etc., etc., etc. Now, that's what I've seen happening, but one of the open questions for me still that I also don't have an answer to is there a way of systematically avoiding work from home to become more individualistic, right? And then systematically, I mean the same as what was the voice of, what was your name again? Dotslav. Okay. Um, he also mentioned how do you get Václav? Okay. Thank you. How do you systematically help teams from improving? And the systematically here is very much like him. Like I can help a team. I think I can help a team become less individualistic from working from home. But it's just because of very explicit effort that I'm doing to the team. But is there a way in which we can, without a coach explicitly doing something to the team, is there a way that we can let that happen systematically? If you do have the answer to these questions, I mean, they're sincere questions. I would love to have the answer to them. Okay. Now that was the one team situation. Are there any questions so far that came up that you're wondering with before we move to multiple teams? Thank you. If you solve my problem, then I'll tell you the secret of these systematically improving teams. Which I also don't really have an answer to, but that's a different thing. Okay, let's go to multiple teams. So now we don't have one team, but we have multiple teams. And basically what I do is I take the variables that we had for one team and I just change them into the multi-team variant. So in the one team, we had the variable of the amount of items a team was working on. Now, if you have multiple teams, probably the multiple teams are not going to work on the same items like a single team. But one of the things that often happens in less adoptions is that you have multiple themes or related items. I'm avoiding, of course, the word epic, which I don't want to use, but related items or theme or goal or however you call it. In almost all less adoptions, we have some things that are related, and typically we have 5 teams, and then we give each team their one area of items they're going to work on, and they kind of work individually on that. And unless we don't really want to do. So we want to reduce the amount of related items, the amount of topics, subjects, themes, related items that the teams are working on. So that you don't have one team working on invoicing and the other team working on sales, but instead we have 2 teams together working on items related to invoicing, and then once they finish that, 2 teams together related on items to sales. And then I consider this variable kind of like the less variant of the reducing WIP in a team, or trying to reduce the WIP in a team. And of course, then also we had here the how did I formulate it? What was it again? Amount of time working together. I could keep their amount of time working together, of course. But a much better way is the amount of time that the teams are working together. Right? One of the things you want to have in less is that it is the barrier to work together with your own team member versus the team member of another team should be as low as possible. It should be almost no difference between that. And of course, less has the multi-team refinement and those kind of things, which I've left out of this model for focus. I could add them there too, but it's not the focus I want to have with my systems model. So there we go. We recreated the entire diagram, but now for multiple teams. So the ability to work on similar items across teams at the same time is the reverse or relationship to the amount of items of related work the team is working on at the same time. Same as before, where we have the ability to leading to the actual effect of that then. And then I replaced shared code here with feature teams, because feature teams is one important aspect of feature teams is the increasing, the scaling up of shared code ownership. And then the rest is the same. We need to have confidence in making changes for feature teams, automated tests is important, etc. So here we can see also that in not just a one-team environment, but in a multi-team environment, it is just as, or maybe even more important to adopt these social team practices that require technical knowledge. That is a too long word for it. Now, is all of this true? This is a nice theory, and I shared your nice theory, my nice theory with you. But of course, we need to remember a little bit that I have a development background. I like those things, and then one of the questions I need to ask myself, of course, is, considering all of the things I just told, do I not tell all of these things because I like development? that is a possibility that I need to of course, keep in mind, that I'm overemphasizing something because that is something that I appreciate or know. And of course, I'm not saying that it is that way. Sorry for this incredibly confusing talk that just raises questions. But it's something that we need to keep in mind. And then, of course, considering this is so impactful to how teams work and to how teams work together, every except for one, every less adoption that I joined, one of the things I do is I ask, can I please pair up with your developer and see some of your code? Let me just tell a story. One of them, I was there and I paired up with a developer, and he had been working on a piece of code and wasn't compiling for 3 days. There were no automated tests yet, and he couldn't commit it because committing it would close the Jira ticket and then send it automatically to QA. Right? And the rest of his team was working on something completely different, but he was working ahead and then one day going to tell the rest of his team. Yeah, it's a horrible story, but it's a typical story when I actually go to a team, right? And when I came to this is also really hard. When I came to this company, they said, we've been doing Scrum for 3 years, right? And then I visited for 2 days, and instead of going forward, it felt for them they were actually going backwards, because now they realized that they weren't even doing what they thought they were actually doing. So how can we truly let companies be aware of their state of these it was too long to type social team practices that require, so I just started adding quotes to it. So why do we need to separate? Because we have this separation. Why did we start at that, right? If you think about it, even the Agile conferences ending up being split in the technical Agile conference and the Agile conference. Right? Why do we do this all the time? Why are we looking at those as if they're separate things? So we're constantly reinforcing this, right? And from a larger perspective, also within an organ, like in my team, not everyone is technical, but we've made this split between the technical people and the not technical people. And the not technical people maybe used to be technical people, but now not anymore. Now they're non-tech, they analyze things, right? And so it's like this constant reinforcement. And the same we talk about, and I'm as guilty of that also. We talk about the technical coaches and the non-technical coaches all the time. So every time, over and over, we split that in the community and in the jobs and in the companies. And no wonder that the technical practices are seen as separate from building a team. But why do we need to do that? I don't know the answer to that either. So then, one of the questions that has come up in discussions between me and Craig is, technical excellence is actually not one of the less principles, and many people actually think it is, but it's not. Now, there's a historic reason on why it's not, and that is we considered continuous improvement towards perfection to actually encapsulate the technical practices, which is why we didn't add it in. But, as they are very important. So maybe we should add technical practices to the less principles to reinforce this. But then, now I did it again, right? I again reinforced technical practices by making it a principle, and then it kind of only grows the divide again between technical and... Now, of course, this talk was called technical question mark practices question mark Scrum question mark, and we need to get to the Scrum part still, because we don't want more principles. Of course, we want less principles. So even if we're going to add a principle to less, then we wouldn't do that unless we also remove a principle from less. And which principles shall we remove then? Well, one of them that I have a little bit of an urge of removing, especially since I'm less enthusiastic about the latest revision of the Scrum Guide, to put it as politely as I can, is that maybe it's a good idea to then remove the large-scale Scrum is Scrum principle from less, and then add the social team practices that require technical skills as a... You see why this is not going to happen tomorrow, but it's something that we'll need to figure out how that might actually fit together. But, then on the other hand, I can't do that, right? Because one of the points of the large-scale Scrum is Scrum principle is to always try to think from one team first and try to solve the problem in a one-team context, and then try to figure out how that would work in a multi-team situation. And that's exactly what I've done in this talk. So I've used the large-scale Scrum is Scrum principle in this talk to make the talk. So then at the end of the talk, removing it wouldn't make any sense then. All these questions. I hope you got something out of this. Try to focus on the social team practices that require technical skills, they are really, really important for your team and for your less adoption. If you're not going to improve those, it will become very, very hard. And try to close that divide between the technical and the non-technical people. And that's the end. Thank you very much. 5 minutes is not too bad, actually, for not having any idea how long it will take. Any questions? I guess they only come tomorrow, probably, after this talk. He says, can we merge systems thinking and lean thinking into thinking? But that would remove a lot of the other ones also. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So the question is, why extract out continuous improvement towards perfection from lean thinking? In fact, if you look at the principles, it has extracted out two principles of Scrum, which is empirical process control and transparency, which are, if you wish, part of Scrum. But we decided that both of those are so important in less context that we wanted to make them separate principles. So, and we made the same decision related to continuous improvement towards perfection, which is of course a part of lean thinking, but we extracted that out of lean thinking to emphasize that. And one of the reasons for that is that I think a continuous theme in less, and especially in the less adoption tools, is to always accept your reality and never giving up on perfection at the same time. Right? So all of the adoption and the way Les thinks about adoption is to look at where we are now and then not say, you know, we are better than we are, but just purely really accepting where we are now and thinking of one thing that we could do, but also never letting go of that continuous improvement towards perfection. Right? Never, in a way, a cost-benefit analysis in less doesn't exist. Right? Because we always want the benefit. And if the cost is now too high, then we'll need to continuously improve to reduce the cost to get that benefit. But it's not a trade-off. You don't ever give up that you want to achieve that. Right? And that's to emphasize that thinking, we wanted to extract that. And also, therefore, it hasn't come to our mind so far to select that as the one to remove. Thank you. Any other questions still? Okay. Thank you very much. And have fun at the rest of the conference.